Hi, I'm Diane Hall from AARP in Kansas City, and I'd like to welcome you to In the Know. Today, our guest is Gina Chiala, the Executive Director and Staff Attorney for the Heartland Center for Jobs and Freedom. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Today, we're going to focus on housing insecurity, unsafe housing, and evictions. But before I start peppering Gina with all of our questions, Gina, could you give our viewers a little bit more information about the range of ways your organization helps people in the community? I know you do a lot more than we're going to cover today.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having us here. We are an organization that focuses on the rights of low-wage workers primarily. And so we know if you're a low-wage worker, you're more likely to end up in a situation where you're abused on the job. We know that you're more likely than others to be exploited by predatory lenders and other predatory businesses. And we know that you're more likely to face eviction. So our organization provides free legal information to low-wage workers in employment, consumer, and housing law. We represent low-wage workers in those three areas as well for free. And then we also cooperate with those movements on the ground that are trying to improve policy issues in these areas.
Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover. Today, we're going to narrow our focus a little bit, and I did put out an ask for questions for people to submit by email to AARP Kansas City. So I've got some questions that we already had, and then I've got some that came in, and I tried to group them a little logically, but here we go anyway. All right. We regularly hear on the news about the impact of the pandemic on employment through the unemployment numbers and things that come in. But what's the local impact of joblessness on housing security?
I think that the local situation is being impacted similarly to how it's being impacted nationally. We know that in Missouri, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk for eviction right now. And we know that many, many people in Missouri are facing unemployment similarly to how they are nationally. And that recently the CARES Act, which provided expanded unemployment and an additional $600 a week to people who lost their jobs, that act has expired. And so people in Missouri are struggling equally to others throughout the country.
Well, and I can understand how the pandemic-related unemployment could keep people from paying their rent, but housing insecurity didn't start with the pandemic, right? What was the situation before? Because I know you've dealt with this for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Diane. Before the pandemic struck, it was already true that we were in an eviction crisis. And the reason that crisis existed is because the rental market had tightened since the recession. That drove landlords to charge higher amounts of rent. And in the meantime, workers' wages didn't keep up. They stagnated. And so there's a growing gap between the amount of money that people bring home and the rents that are being charged in the market by landlords. And that gap means that people are having to live in housing that is difficult to afford. And any small mishap can put someone on the edge in a way that puts them in the crosshairs of eviction. So if you work a job that doesn't have guaranteed hours, they could cut your hours and you can end up facing eviction. If you get in a car accident or get sick and you miss some work, that could put you close enough to being short on your rent and facing eviction. So many, a car breaking down, there's just any small mishap these days can lead people to falling short on the rent and then facing eviction. And so that's the reason why so many people were already facing eviction before this crisis, before the pandemic even began. And now, of course, the risks that come with eviction now are just exacerbated by the pandemic, because now we have all the public health risks that come along with all of the other detrimental impacts of eviction. So starting off the conversation with a little bit of a downer, but it's always good to recognize that reality because we're all in this together. We want to make it better.
Absolutely. And, if you don't understand the situation, you don't know how you can help. So right. It's maybe a little bit of a downer, but it's good information to have. You talked about the reasons that some people weren't being able to pay rent before COVID, but what if someone can't pay their rent now due to COVID or any other issues? What are their options?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so right now, our Congress has failed to act. Congress has failed to enact any emergency rental relief, failed to enact a moratorium. The Missouri governor has also failed to do the same thing. So right now, there's no defense for eviction based on the fact that you may have lost your job due to no fault of your own and because of the pandemic. But that doesn't mean you're without options.
Okay.
If you have fallen behind on the rent, we have a letter and a settlement form that you can use to attempt to negotiate something with your landlord, to engage in discussions, engage in negotiations, to attempt to come up with some amicable solution between you and your landlord. And we're happy to help with that. If you end up facing eviction, sometimes there are ways for us to negotiate settlement agreements under those circumstances too. So while we don't have the legal protections that we need for people who have fallen behind on their rent, it doesn't mean that people are powerless. And if people want to access those forms, they can access them on our website, shown here on the screen. And you can always call our hotline, which is running on this screen as well.
Well, it kind of related to that. One of the questions that came in, it's about what you can do with your lease if you can't pay. So can I break my lease if I've lost my job and can't pay my rent? It's somebody who's willing to not occupy the space because they know they can't pay. The landlord knows they can't pay. But can they break the lease due to those circumstances?
There's no legal protection, again, for you breaking your lease because you lost your job, even though there should be. There should be that legal protection. It's not there right now. But again, that doesn't mean you can't try to negotiate with their landlord. If your landlord knows you're not going to be able to pay the rent, and if they sue you, they're not going to get any money from you anyway. And so letting them know that that's your situation and trying to negotiate with them in a way that prevents them from suing you for breaking your lease would be the best, possible outcome. And again, we have forms that you can use to make sure that if you do enter an agreement with your landlord to break your lease without penalty, because most leases have a penalty for that, that it's a binding agreement. What we suggest is, when you negotiate with your landlord, don't base it on trust. You want to really get it in writing and make sure it's a binding agreement. And we have forms that can help you do that.
Great. So what should a tenant do if they are sued for unpaid rent? I mean, now what's the next step?
They should call us immediately, and we can look at your situation and determine whether we can represent you. We can also help you connect with legal aid, see if legal aid can represent you. But the most important thing to do is not ignore the lawsuit. Sometimes people feel defeated the moment they see that lawsuit on their door, the moment someone serves it to them in person. The most important thing is don't ignore it. Call for legal help right away. And don't just appear in court without calling either. There are ramifications of how you were served, and we might want to discuss all of the circumstances with you before you actually appear in court. But don't miss court. Just make sure to call us before court so we can talk about your case.
Okay, a related question. You hear about landlords who threaten to garnish future earnings and all kinds of things like that. Legally, so people know, what are the steps that a landlord has to take to get payment for back rent?
Well, they would have to first bring a suit. So they wouldn't be able to garnish your paycheck or your bank account unless they actually sue you. And that's true for the actual eviction too. So nobody can legally remove you from your home unless they have first sued you in court, served you with that lawsuit, and then won. And that's true with garnishment too. So once that judgment exists against you, if the landlord is able to determine where you work or determine where you bank, they might go ahead and pursue a garnishment against you using the legal process. Yes, and so again, it's something where if that's happening to you, you didn't know about the lawsuit, you just suddenly get garnished, or you suddenly realize you're being evicted and you didn't know about the lawsuit. Sometimes there's things you can do about that legally. So again, it's just important to get legal help.
So Just for my own edification, don't they have to give some sort of notice to the tenant that they're going to pursue some sort of legal course of action?
Well, unfortunately, they really don't if it's for rent. If it's a rent and possession case, the lawsuit itself can act as the notice without the landlord providing pre-suit notice. There's another kind of eviction called unlawful detainer. That's the kind of eviction that a landlord might pursue if they gave you notice to leave and you stayed, or they said you broke your lease, you need to leave, and you still stayed. Even if you paid your rent, they may try to evict you in those circumstances, but those circumstances do require that the landlord gives written notice. So two kinds of cases. If it's just for rent, they don't have to give notice. If they're saying you overstayed the actual tenancy, then they do have to give you notice. So kind of a complicated answer.
Sorry, so just one more clarifying on that. But if you're being sued through the court for back payment of rent or for eviction, there will be some sort of notification from the court that comes.
Yes.
Okay.
In that situation, you have to be served with a lawsuit. If there's no service, the court doesn't have jurisdiction over you. So sometimes we'll have a situation where a tenant finds out about a suit after they've moved and their neighbor calls and says, hey, someone put a lawsuit on your door. I mean, it's our contention that if the landlord knew you were gone and put that suit on your door, that's not proper service. So that's why it's good to talk to a lawyer and check and see whether service was proper. But yes, so in a eviction case, they're allowed to serve you in two different ways. They can either come to your door and hand you that lawsuit, and that would subject you through the legal process to all of the damages that they're demanding money-wise and to actually being pushed out of the house. There's another way they can serve you where they just mail it to you and put it on your door and don't hand it to you. And in those circumstances, the landlord can only pursue a possession judgment where they're seeking to put you out of the house, but they're not allowed to get any money out of that judgment if the only thing they do is put it on the door, unless you show up in court. That judgment will still hurt you. So these things can get a little complicated, and it's good to talk to a lawyer about service. And that's the reason before that I said, don't just show up to court without talking to a lawyer first if you can avoid it, because there may be some issues with how you were served that we want to think through with you before you appear.
Okay. Well, how long after someone is evicted can the landlord go ahead and sue for that back rent? Or does it all come together in one lawsuit?
Yeah, you cannot be evicted without the lawsuit. So really, eviction's kind of a not really a legal term. It's just a term that we all use to talk about this process of being forced out of your home by your landlord. But legally, you cannot be forced out of your house, and you cannot face those damages unless a landlord has actually brought suit against you and gotten a judgment against you. And let me clarify, I said you can't face those damages. That's not exactly true. A landlord can continue to try to collect back rent from you after you've moved out. So let's say the landlord gives you a letter and says, hey, you haven't paid rent. I want you to leave within the next 30 days. And you do leave, but you also don't pay the back rent. They can still continue to try to get you to pay. They just can't garnish your wages or your bank account unless they actually sue and get a judgment against you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That clarifies that quite a bit. What about renters who can't pay, and after the moratorium went away, the landlord gives them this payment plan, and they can't pay even that? What do they do with that?
Yeah, it gets tough. I mean, it's important to call 211. That's the United Way's hotline number where somebody can interview you and see if there's any aid available for you, whether it's someplace to go or rental assistance. And our organization has joined together with other organizations trying to get more aid available for renters who we know just need a little help to get through this period. And so, you can reach out to us too, but yeah, the situation is tough, and the only thing you can do is continue to try to negotiate with your landlord, get legal help. Sometimes you might work out a payment plan, and then you can't keep, like you said, you can't comply with that plan you may need to think about, is there a big shift I need to make here? I'm not going to be able to make this rent long term. I'm going to probably get evicted. Let me face that reality and figure out, is there a family member or a friend I can stay with for a while? What are some backup options for me at this time? And I know that's a grim situation, but unfortunately, I know it can be the reality for many people right now.
Yeah,
and before the pandemic, yeah.
And we do have some questions about that a little further down on my little question list here, but I brought up the moratorium. What are the chances that there will be a new moratorium on evictions, and how important is that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of confusion because of President Trump's executive order that kind of mentioned evictions. So there's been some confusion. We've heard from tenants who think that there's an eviction moratorium now nationally, and I do wish that were true. It is not. The executive order did not actually have any teeth, did not issue a moratorium. So there's no moratorium in place right now issued by Congress, issued by the president, issued by the state of Missouri, or issued by our local courts or our state courts. So there is no moratorium right now. There should be, and the chances of there being one really just depends on how active we are in the democratic process and how loud we make our voices around this issue. So there are groups like KC Tenants who are organizing tenants to try to advocate for support during this period and before this period for a moratorium and for the support that renters need who are struggling. Because what we don't want to see is a huge outpouring of people from their homes into the streets, into homeless shelters, into their cars, doubling up with families, tripling up with families. We know that public health wise, that's going to make a significant contribution to the spread of the virus. We know that it's traumatic for all of those families and for children who are trying to go to school and learn and study. It has a generational impact. And then, of course, we know it also affects all of us financially, because the more people who sink into poverty, and eviction sinks people further into poverty for a long period of time, the harder it is going to be for all of us to recover economically. So we want to try to stop that from happening. And so our local court, our presiding judge, does have the power to issue a moratorium. He's done it once before, but he has been reluctant to do it again. So there's a lot of people trying to support him, giving him the confidence to know that, look, the public supports you here. We believe this is the right thing to do. The governor absolutely has the power to issue a moratorium, but he's been very resistant to do that too. So it's hard to say what the chances are, but I will say it's up to us to push for what we believe is the right way. The right way for housing to be handled during this period.
So is there anything that the general public could do to support a new moratorium?
Yeah, I think that the public can be in contact with this organization called KC Tenants. They are the organization that is pushing to enact moratoriums at the local, state, and national level. And so participating and supporting KC Tenants is one way that you can support that. Of course, always making phone calls to your own officials. Congress has the power to enact a moratorium. They have the power to enact rental relief. So calling your members of Congress is another way, of course, to support that.
Say a little bit more about what rental relief is.
Well, I think it can come in different, I think it can come through different programs. Some programs might make it so that if a landlord agrees to work with a tenant, or a landlord agrees to cancel rent for a certain period of time, that landlord has the right to then seek that assistance from the fund. There are other funds structured where the tenant is the one seeking that assistance. And so it really just depends on how policymakers structure it. But what we do know is that it's possible. We have the ability and the resources in this country to do it. It's just a matter of making it a priority.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about the inability to pay rent due to factors arising from coronavirus and evictions, but there are people out there who are paying their rent and they are keeping up, but the landlord isn't keeping his or her part of the bargain and maintaining the home. So what can a renter do if their landlord is not maintaining a safe and livable home?
Yeah, that's a really common problem. Some studies say that 40% of tenants facing eviction actually have these kinds of issues. So it's a big problem. And what we're talking about are problems with the home that relate to the livability of that home. So we're not talking about those small things that can be annoying, but we're talking about very significant problems. Problems with the plumbing, the sewer backs up, the plumbing is really dysfunctional, maybe causing major leaks in the home. We're talking about electricity that may or may not work. We've heard from tenants where outlets are smoking, or there's no electricity throughout a certain room or portions of the house. We're talking about infestations, mice, cockroaches, bed bugs. Everybody has a right to live free of infestations because they are unsanitary and unhealthy, and they put your health and your kids' health at risk. We're talking about potentially, structural issues, ceilings falling in, things like that. So we're talking about serious issues. Unfortunately, there are those landlords out there who purchase a lot of houses and don't hire the help necessary to keep those houses in good repair. It's an endemic problem. So what you should do is, if you're having this problem, first and most important thing to do is put it in writing. You want to go ahead and write a letter to your landlord describing those issues and asking for the landlord to fix those. You may do that by phone. Most people just hop on the phone and do it, or send a text message, but you want to send a letter, and we do have a form letter on our website that you can use to do that. And then you want to keep a copy, because under the law, if you haven't given the landlord notice and a reasonable time to fix that problem, then you don't have any claim. You don't have any legal protection. And by sending a letter, you have proof that's pretty indisputable that you gave the landlord notice of those things. You also want to document all those conditions. And smartphones are so prevalent these days that tenants are pretty good at doing that. So when the basement is flooding, you're taking a video of that. When and go ahead, and this sounds gross, but if you have infestation, collect the physical manifestations of that problem. So you may be, putting a bed bug in a bag, or etc. I won't go into detail. You might be eating breakfast or something. But collect proof, take pictures, and make sure that you keep that proof in a safe place. And then if that doesn't work, you can also call Healthy Homes. You can do that by calling 311, which is the city's hotline number. We gave you 211 earlier. That's for resources. 311 is the city hotline, and you can call and ask for a Healthy Homes inspection. If you want to talk to a lawyer before doing that, you can. There are some issues that could lead to your house getting closed by Healthy Homes if the issues are severe enough. So if you want to kind of think through that with us in advance, you can. You can also maybe call anonymously and say, hey, I have this kind of problem. What's the risk of you shutting down my house, and see if that works. But you can call Healthy Homes for an inspection. They can ticket the landlord, and that may put some pressure on the landlord to fix those problems. And if that doesn't work, then it's possible to take your landlord to small claims court and seek back rent and pay your rent into the court instead of paying the landlord. What we don't recommend is that you actually withhold that rent yourself. And most people struggle to pay their rent already for good reason. Wages are too low. They struggle to pay their rent already. And then when they withhold that rent, they spend it on the water bill. They spend it on stuff the kids need, and they don't have that rent going forward and can get sued by the landlord and end up in a very bad situation. So we don't recommend you withhold that rent. We recommend you sue your landlord, pay that rent into the court, let the court decide whether you're allowed to keep that rent or whether the landlord should get that rent. And again, we can walk you through the process. We can provide you with the forms you need to be able to enforce your rights.
We talked a little bit earlier. You were talking about needing to find a more affordable place to live, and got a question that came in that says, I need a cheaper place to live, but my credit score has gone down because of the pandemic-related income issues, and I can't qualify under most leasing requirements, but I have a great payment history. How can I get around that requirement?
That sounds really tough, and I'm sorry to hear that you're going through that. I think the best thing you can do is demonstrate and really try to get in front of that landlord to have a good discussion with them, to demonstrate that you're solid, you're in a good place, you can be relied upon despite that credit score, and just try to get into a situation where you're really able to tell that landlord or management company your story, and and that's really all that you can do. There are some organizations out there that do help people who are trying to not credit repair. Don't go to like for-profit credit repair companies, but there are nonprofit organizations that can help you attempt to strategize around the best ways to improve your credit. And I think calling 211, the United Way hotline, is a good way to get in contact with some of those organizations. But some of those issues may be outside your control at the moment, and so all you can do is search, do the most exhaustive searches you can, and really try to be creative in thinking about ways to demonstrate to the landlord that you're reliable. It may even include getting some extra letters of support from coworkers, from employers, from church groups, other people who support you in your community. But yeah, I'm sorry to hear you're going through that, and I don't think there's a real easy way to fix it.
I have one more question that kind of came in through other channels, which is something that may also be happening more during the pandemic, is renters violating their lease's occupancy rules. They may have a relative who's lost their job. They have a spare bedroom. They say, oh yeah, come stay with me. But of course the relative can't be put on the lease because they don't qualify because they've lost their job. How long can they stay, and when do you have to report that you have an additional occupant as opposed to a guest? What's that time frame like?
That's such a good question. I bet that's something I hadn't thought of that I bet is happening a lot out there. So it's a great question. It's going to depend on your lease. So the lease is really the law of your rental. And so they're not fun to read, but go back, pull it out, look at the headings, can really help you navigate and figure out what part to focus in on so you don't just sit there and read the whole thing. But there will probably be a heading that deals with other occupants, and that tells you, you're allowed to have someone for 2 weeks. And if they stay past 2 weeks, you have to report it. It might be silent as to that. Or it may say you simply can't have other occupants. So what you may want to do is, it's something where you have to make a careful decision around whether to disclose it to the landlord. And if the occupant hasn't moved in yet, then you can always talk to the landlord and try to negotiate some sort of agreement with them around allowing that additional occupant for some period of time. But again, you want to make sure and get that in writing, because that is the kind of thing they might file a notice of eviction around if it is a lease violation.
Okay. So you've talked a lot about the different things that you can do and should do, but how do people get help from Heartland Center for Jobs and Freedom? And does it cost a lot of money? How does this work?
It is free. You can call our hotline for free. There's no charge there. That number, again, is running as a banner on the bottom of this screen, 816-278-1344. And as far as actual representation by us goes, if you're facing eviction, we have to make that determination on a case-by-case basis, but the representation is free. And our guidelines are, we can represent you if you make less than 200% of the poverty line or less than $15 an hour, whichever is greater. So if you make less than $15 an hour, it's easy. You could qualify for us, and then we just have to look at your case and determine whether we can provide you with representation.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about what the Heartland Center for Jobs and Freedom can do for others. What is it that you can get help for from the public? What can we do to help Heartland Jobs and Freedom in their mission?
Well, thank you so much for asking that question. There's a lot you can do. One valuable service that people help us with is volunteering. We have an eviction defense team that helps us screen the 300 calls that we're receiving every month from tenants who are having problems with their landlords. It's a lot of work, but it's really meaningful work. And those people who volunteer become trained in how landlord-tenant law works and how to conduct interviews with tenants and people in crisis. So we have volunteers who help us do those interviews, and then those volunteers work with our staff and our attorneys to come up with an analysis and an action plan for that tenant. So a lot of our volunteers find that to be very meaningful. There is a banner at the bottom of the screen now that shows you the URL that you can click on and simply sign up. And then we will try to get you in our next training. So that's one way you can help. Another way you can help if you're able, we know that some people are able now and other people's not so much, is financial support. As I mentioned before, our legal services are completely free. They're pro bono. And in order for us to be able to do that work, we really do need and rely upon help from the public, donations from the public to be able to carry out that work. And we have a donation button on our website, which again is shown, thank you, Diane, at the bottom of the screen. You can do a monthly donation that just comes right out of your bank account, so you barely feel it, $10, $20, $50, depending on what kind of profession you work, or if you're retired and have extra income. You could also do a one-time donation as well, based on the amount that you want to give at any given time. So we really appreciate the financial support of the public because it's the only way we can do this work.
Well, Gina, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule with 300 calls a month. I'm sure you're very busy, to help us kind of understand some of the issues around housing security. Do you have any last thoughts or advice for our viewers?
Just a reminder, if you know low-wage workers, people who are struggling on the jobs, they're having employment issues, they're having consumer issues with a car dealer or a finance company, or you're having housing issues, please feel free to call us and see if we can help you out. And we're all in this together. These are hard times, but we're all in this together. And thank you so much, Diane, for having us on your show.
Well, Gina, thank you again for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. And a big thanks to our audience for logging on. If you've missed a phone number or a website, you can watch this video again on AARP Missouri's Facebook page or YouTube channel. And while you're there, remember to like AARP on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube so you'll know about our next live event. Until then, thanks for watching.
Thanks, everyone.